Welcome, everybody. My name is Guido Hausmann. I'm a member of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission, and I have the honor to chair our first panel. And if you take a look at the program, you see that we have a slight change in the program because Professor Jan Kubik couldn't arrive yesterday. He will join us, he might join us, but later, so he's not yet here. I have the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Gesine Schwan, who arrived yesterday. Professor Schwan is a very well-known public figure and public intellectual in Germany, and not only in Germany. And I would like to introduce her by highlighting just 3 areas of her many achievements and many activities. First, she's a very well-known political scientist. She has studied at the Free University in Berlin and at the University of Freiburg, and also at Polish universities. She has completed and defended in 1917 her dissertation on the well-known Polish political philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, and a few years later, in 1975, her second dissertation on Karl Marx and his view on society, on contemporary society as well. For many years, she served as a professor of political sciences at the Free University of Berlin from 1977 to 1999, so for more than 20 years. And then from 1999 to 2008, she served as the president of the University of Frankfurt-Oder, the so-called Viadrina University, at the German-Polish border, town of Frankfurt-Oder. A second area of her achievements and of her activities is certainly she has been particularly interested in Poland, and throughout her professional life has been very actively and prominently engaged in promoting better relations between Germans and Poles, or between Germany and Poland. And this can be partly explained by her family background, which is partially from Upper Silesia. To name just a few of her many activities in this field is she was the coordinator for German-Polish cooperation of the German government between 2004 and 2009, and the Association for Student Exchange between Germany and Poland and other countries of Central Europe was acting since 2005 under her auspices. These are just 2 examples. And last but not least, third, Professor Gesine Schwan is a long-term and very prominent member of the German Social Democratic Party. For many years, she has been a member of the so-called Grundwertekommission of the party. That is a commission on the principal values of the German Social Democratic Party, and she has also chaired this commission. Most well known is probably that she was twice, in 2004 and 2009, a candidate for the highest political position in Germany, the presidency. Professor Gesine Schwan is until today very actively publishing. She is a public figure in our media. She is publishing very lately on questions of democratic values, also on questions of political, cultural, social changes in Europe and in the European Union. So I'm very happy that you are here with us, and I'm looking forward to your keynote.
Thank you, Guido Hausmann, for your very kind introduction, and in general, thank you very much for the invitation, which I very much enjoyed getting and which I enjoy now partly practicing, so to say. I have to say that during the last 15 years, I have not been actively a scholar. But I have been a president of a university. This is not being actively a scholar. This is to be a manager or to develop an organization. And afterwards, I have been more committed to public debates and political debates, very much on Europe, etc. But I really do enjoy to take part in that conference. You mentioned that I was very much involved in German-Polish relations, and as president of the European University Viadrina, of course, in general, in German Central European relationships at the Viadrina, we had a program, and we have it still, I think, but I finished my career at the Viadrina in 2008, a program where we had each year 12 Ukrainian students. We are a small university, but these 12 Ukrainian students were always carefully selected, etc., and they were an important part of our life in the university. Coming out of a rather political family, born in '43, of course, dealing with the past was, so to say, a kind of existential continuum. When I grew up in my family, for the meals, we had discussions about what National Socialist Germany had committed, what they had, the crimes they had done, etc. So dealing with the past was a very important point. And in Germany, and I was asked to give this keynote a little bit from a German point of view, of course, on the one hand, reconciliation is important, but the other point was also, and this is more what I would like to deal with, and I think implicitly that will also say something about reconciliation, how to deal with the past, with the dictatorial past, with the totalitarian past, and how to overcome the cultural legacies of that past in order to get into a democracy. So the point of political culture stemming from a dictatorial past and getting over to a democratic political system. This is a very often discussed point in Germany, and this will also be my main perspective. I'm not at all a historian, I'm a philosopher and a political science. Political theory was my field, political psychology, and you will feel that when I try to give my presentation. And I'm not at all knowledgeable about really Ukrainian history. Of course, we all try to be more or less informed about what happens, but as far as I see it, the case of Ukraine is not only a case between Poland and Ukraine, or Ukraine and Russia, which always suggests that there are kind of homogeneous collective identities, national identities, but that also within the Ukrainian society there are a lot of different points of views. And when we followed during the last 15, 20 years the whole history of memory, which I did with France and which I did also with Poland, and if we followed the ideas of Nora, the historical places, we discovered that the national identities and reconciliation is a little bit formulated in analogy to individuals who get into reconciliation to each other. The idea of collective identities gets a little bit more pluralistic. To give you an example, there is a very nice, very important book about, of course, we had französische Erinnerungsorte, the locations, I don't know, what is the places of memory of Nora. And then we had the German Erinnerungsorte with Etienne François and Hagen Schulze, who did that. And then we had the German-Polish Erinnerungsorte with Traber, Robert Traber, and the guy from Osnabrück, is it right? No. Yeah, right. And what we discovered, if we get into depth with the memories of these collective identities, that these memories are extremely diverse. And we had a very nice meeting, I remember, with Adam Michnik, whom you mentioned also, a good, very, very good old friend of mine. And he said during that meeting, well, there will never be any community between the Polish and the German memory of Bismarck. He stated that quite dogmatically. And I like, if he states something dogmatically, you can always be sure that there's also a small portion of irony in that. But he did not say that ironically. He said there will never be such a community. And then I said, you know, if you are a German Catholic socialist, you have much more in common with the Polish memory of Bismarck than a German Protestant national person. Because Bismarck did not like the socialists, he did not like the ultramontane, or whatsoever Catholics. I happen to be a Catholic socialist myself, so, you know, my memory about Bismarck is kind of mixed, and certainly not predominated by my being German. And this is what they discovered in the German-Polish memories of places of memory, that the women had different memories, and the various political parts had different memories of the past, etc. And I have to say that I very much greet these diversities, because in my view, they are the precondition of real reconciliation. It's only if you get into the depths of diversity of collective identities, if you do not make out of that a homogeneity which is not really existing. If you do not do that, you will not get into reconciliation. It's only if you get into depths empirically, what happened, what was the memory, in which constellation, etc., that you can come to this much more fundamental idea of reconciliation. Because in fact, reconciliation is an individual procedure. It is not a collective procedure. You can have all these public memories, Jan Assmann, etc., of course. But this is, you celebrate the reconciliation between Germany and France, between Germany and Poland. But as soon as the Polish party of Prawo I Sprawiedliwość is in governance, suddenly the whole thing changed on the level of government, not on the level of society. This is what I experienced when I was the official agent, so to say, for the German government during the first peace government. We had already 2 of these years, and they were quite demanding, so to say. So this is why I will deal in this presentation with the question how to learn from the past to achieve a viable future. This is a more general term, and I think when we can see which are the implications for reconciliation also for that. To achieve a viable future, learning from the past, both terms are quite complex, and I will try, being a philosopher, to get into depth with that. People want a viable future. The extent to which this deep-seated aspiration shapes our lives often surprises us. For example, when we find out an illness is terminal and that we have a limited time left. We fall into despair because we no longer have a future. And yet, does the future refer only to our life expectancy? Do we not fall into despair and even depression when we can no longer find any meaning in the life that lies ahead of us? That is, when we see no hope. Does hope need a future? What do we hope for when we wish for a viable future? I would like to expand on 2 concepts that are central to my understanding of a positive future: liberty and happiness. In general, we all hope for a happy, a successful life, and that what the Greek philosophy called a good life, which does not just mean drink red wine, which was very good yesterday evening. You can drink red wine, that's fine, but the good life is a life in relation to our potentials, etc. A successful life, which might even happen for certain times within prison, right? A good life is not just a constantly happy life. So we all hope for a good, a meaningful life, both as individuals as nations. The precise elements that constitute a happy and successful or good life, meaningful life, are not easy to pinpoint. Most certainly, they include not having to starve, suffer from thirst, or be exposed to the cold, as well as having a roof over one's head and having at least our most basic physical needs met. When these elements are in short supply, the more we understand that we are finite beings, unable to extract ourselves from our fate. If we think about it, we can imagine what it might be like for individuals who go to bed hungry at night, and what is in the future we want to achieve for ourselves. Does it disturb us that there are starving and freezing people out there? The major religions tell us it should bother us, that we should turn our attention to those suffering in the world. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Jesus says this with a view to the final judgment. You know all this very famous word. This fundamental principle of Christianity, we call for brotherly love and justice, has its equivalent in Jewish and Muslim traditions as well. These are normative directives. Does a successful life involve more than just our own happiness? Is it possible that one of the elements of our own successful lives is the knowledge that other people have the opportunity to live happily as well? Does it also include justice for all and solidarity among peoples? In research on justice and also in recent economic studies, experts have determined that a majority of individuals feel uneasy when they realize they are clearly better off than others. Indeed, when catastrophes occur, we often notice a quite impressive readiness to help. In other words, when a tangible event occurs that enables a clear expression of compassion, we feel a desire to help and seek justice. In such cases, the religious principle is supported by experience. How long can it be sustained? How far does it reach? We often absolve ourselves of responsibility for the step we know needs to come next, which is to create fair conditions. That step, we leave it up to policymakers. This is not anymore our private deal. And yet, a glance at the past shows us that it is difficult to separate our private from the political life. That is, from the other order of public affairs. We are forced to recognize the fact that blatant injustice and arbitrary political behavior repeatedly endanger and even destroy private happiness. They also often provoke rebellions, seeing as people do not appreciate being robbed of their livelihoods and opportunities. Social welfare programs attempt to save people from facing poverty. Sometimes they even attempt to force people to do what's good for them. At this point, the state interventions in the private sphere is an important point. We merely have to look at the totalitarian regimes of the past century to see that we cannot disregard politics when we are looking to establish justice, and especially when we seek to live in freedom. Freedom is possibly humanity's greatest issue. All over the major philosophies since ancient times refer to the desire for freedom, the will to resist delivering oneself up powerlessly to the despotism of others, and the need to be recognized and respected. Over the centuries, the desire for freedom gained in importance and ultimately prevailed. The future we desire seeks a life in freedom for all. Freedom is a guarantee of our dignity. This is not something we are always aware of in our everyday lives. We experience abuses of power, we get upset about it, we try to come to terms with it. However, major crises have the power to radically confront us with the challenge of jeopardizing our own lives and private happiness for the sake of political freedom and dignity. This kind of courage and sacrifice provide valid lessons, reasons for historical sites of democracy. And Maidan certainly is such a historical site of democracy. We need to be aware that sacrifices such as these are being made in many parts of the world every day, due to despotism and repression. People stand up against injustice and a lack of freedom because their conscience demands it of them, even when they know that it could cost them their lives. This proves that what I would call, with the ancient philosophy, a good future, as a good life, and Hannah Arendt has written a lot about that. This proves that a good future cannot be something private and withdrawn. Instead, it must include the public and the political. Seeing as misguided policymaking can also destroy private happiness, we must fight in our own interest for freedom, justice, and solidarity. But we are also obligated to do the same for our fellow human beings, to whom we are united in solidarity. The German philosopher Karl Jaspers, when he dealt with the question of guilt in 45-46, this German philosopher Karl Jaspers referred to this as our metaphysic guilt. If we want to have a good life, successful life, we have to fight and win this battle time and again. We see this not only as an obligation, but also as an opportunity. Showing solidarity with fellow human beings opens up the possibility of transforming our good private lives into successful lives by liberating our existence from private isolation and filling it with meaning. There has been a lot of discussions about the way how the Germans surprisingly dealt with the refugees in Germany. They were not expected to deal the way they did. And many always say, oh, that can't last long, this is such a heavy stuff, etc. And what very often in that discussion is overlooked, is not seen, is that helping the refugees is also a meaningful thing. That people are not just under the burden of helping, but that they experience that as a meaningful action. Very often, elderly people, professors of schools, who live isolated, they are materially very well off, but they don't have any sense of their life anymore. They have no communication. That is maybe less imaginable here in Ukraine, where you are still a much more sociable society, but that's not the case in Germany. And many of them are extremely enjoying suddenly coming into communication, having a sense for life, etc. It's not just a burden. New experiences. The word meaning points to a larger context, one in which our individual lives find their place, lose their arbitrariness, and are given a purpose. Indeed, it is difficult to confront one's own randomness and insignificance on a daily basis. If we do not succeed in dealing with our condition, it is easy to feel empty in ourselves. In our daily lives, we often push this to the side. We content ourselves with routine tasks that provide meaning or at least distract us. There's a very famous literature, for instance, by Blaise Pascal about distraction, which is one of the most important challenges to push aside the question of the meaningful life. We also spend time with friends and acquaintances that mean something to us. These are precious indeed. Successful interpersonal relationships in which we support and strengthen each other are especially essential for a good life. And yet, we need even more. All of us long for an overarching horizon of meaning that friendship and love can serve. In the past, people understood the concept of meaning quite differently, especially in the grand myths and religions. Today, we have been robbed of the illusion that there exists an objective and generally binding meaning, especially one that we might be able to prove. Metaphysics and proof of the existence of God have come to an end. In fact, they were replaced by haughty nationalism already in the 19th and 20th centuries. These movements showed that people tend to seeking meaning and a replacement for religion, indeed, that they probably need it. But they also show the kind of destruction that can result from the arrogance of proclaiming to have an objective, pseudo-religious meaning by means of a Volk and Führer, for instance, or via an omniscient party avant-garde. Such hubris leads to servitude and crime. After the catastrophes experienced under totalitarian regimes and dictatorships, the freedom to find meaning in our own existence has become even dearer to us. In November 1989, Germans experienced precisely such a moment of raised consciousness for freedom. Indeed, it was the most positive 9th of November ever in our German history. It marked not only the dramatic move towards a unified and democratic Germany, but also the end of a series of historical political simplifications and distortions. That is, the GDR as a pristine nation of anti-fascists, and West Germany as a happy and refined democracy. These cliches, these self-images, were sustained during the decades of the Cold War, often without the faintest hint of self-criticism, and made it all the more difficult to reach an agreement on Germany's historical political status as a whole. And also, by the way, it impeded a reconciliation between East Germans and Western Germans. 40 years of incessant competition between the two German states that had fundamentally different view on how to interpret the past and the present, these years demonstrates quite clearly how difficult it is for us to see our position as being meaningful in a context when it is not simply given to us. In other words, it is difficult when we ourselves are responsible for locating, defining, and justifying our position. The state cannot prescribe this, because if that were the case, we would have to take leave of our status as responsible and engaged citizens and return to being serfs and subjects under the state again. This is a dilemma to which the freedom of modernity has led us. We cannot escape it. We want a political order driven by a devotion to freedom. It is a precondition for our hope-filled future, but it is limited in its ability to provide meaning to our successful or good lives. It has to leave citizens the space to find meaning on their own. We live in a pluralistic society whose diversity we recognize and seek to confirm. After all, politics can work in the service of freedom to enhance the experience of meaning, but it cannot replace it. If our goal is to achieve a viable future, that is, we hope for a good life marked by freedom, justice, and solidarity, then we must accept that it is also possible for us to lose this viable future. How? For example, as a result of mistaken behavior in the present, by missing our blowing opportunities, repeating mistakes, exacerbating conflicts, and foregoing the opportunity to come to an agreement that have helped us avoid future conflicts, or at least maneuver them towards a more positive outcome. Can the past help us to steer clear of these mistakes? Can knowledge of the past guide us towards more future-oriented actions? Can it take us beyond the fatal conceit of the formal imperative and history to which we would have to subordinate ourselves, thus preventing any chance of a future in freedom. In other words, can we learn from the past to achieve a viable future? The past does not exempt us from the obligation to find our own meaning of life. However, it does offer us a veritable treasure chest of experiences and orientations we can examine so as to avoid mistakes and find our own meaning. When we neglect the past, it often takes us prisoner without us noticing, thus robbing us of our chance of freedom. What is the past? First of all, it is a time that we in the present have left behind us. But is the minute just past before the now also the past? There's a long, long philosophical analysis of Hegel about das Jetzt, the now. What is it? Is it the past? Is it the present? Is it the future? No. The last night before today, is that the past? Purely in terms of time? Yes, of course, in the sense of a reality we can look back on and gauge as being a certain distance from the now, even though we cannot logically determine it. Indeed, we associate the past with ideas about things that happened in the past, things that we did, what others did to us. Put together, these create a whole and thus a distance from the present. At the same time, these ideas often extend unconsciously into the present. Marital disputes, for example, often revolve around events that occurred long ago, an absence of love that stuck in one's head. They are the past, but they live on in the present moment, in the form of our memories and in our attitude towards our partners. The past reaches into the present. In other words, we first meet the past spontaneously in our memory. It has a bearing on our lifetime. And many scientific studies have shown how strong our memories, that is the idea of making the past present, are shaped by our desires and fears. We use the past selectively. The past we remember and the present we experience are interwoven. In this process, one experience plays a prominent role. In general, our memory operates like a film, running in the background, asking the questions, how did I fare then? What kind of position was I in? Did I behave well in the past? These questions go to the core of our self-esteem and play a decisive role in the subconscious selection of what exactly we remember. We take our identity from positive memories and block out elements that do not fit our preferred self-image. Indeed, it takes much self-control and even discipline to call up a past in which we did not fare so well, one that threatens our feelings of self-worth. In the tradition of all major religions, this entails a process of soul-searching. In a slight modification of a famous Goethe saying, one might say, tell me what you remember, and I will tell you who you are. This soul-searching is a constant challenge for all of us, not only in the sense that we all are aware of the courage required to face difficult experiences in the past, but also because our identity, that is the sameness of our own person, emerges both in and through our memory. The identity is not a given thing. The identity is the result of what we remember. Indeed, we live under the assumption that we are the same person throughout our lives, regardless of external and internal changes. We experience the exact opposite when people lose their memory. That is, when the bridge between individuals disappears for them and for us, beyond the equally changeable physical body. from one day to the next. This is a very unfortunate experience that gains in importance as the number of dementia cases in our societies increases. Our reliable memory thus makes us a person identical to ourselves and at the same time a recognizable and reliable partner for others. In this process, factual details are less important. Much more important is the consistency and harmonious connection between different behaviors and statements in the past and present. That is, one must ask oneself whether one might in fact be living according to the motto, what do I care about the rubbish I said yesterday? This coherence does not require that I always say or think the same thing. If it did, I would most likely not be human. To live means to change. In fact, changes even add to the connections and thus strengthen identity, at least when they are made consciously and in a reasoned manner with given grounds, and when they are brought into a convincing relation with earlier, now changed positions. In this case, for example, the rejection of recognized errors leads to a strengthening of the personality because we have called up enough courage to clearly and precisely gain insight into what was false and into what could have inhibited our self-esteem. And this is, of course, also a precondition of any reconciliation. If you are not daring to look into what you committed, there will never be a real reconciliation. In the case of abandoned youth, police officers and social workers who have not repressed their own youthful blunders enjoy a special kind of authority. These are individuals who remember their mistakes, what it felt like at the time, and the damage they might have inflicted, and it allows them to show understanding for the mistakes of young people and the necessity to reverse them at the same time. They have learned from the past has strengthened them and given them the opportunity to pass this strength on to the youth of today, to help them avoid making the same mistakes again, to acquire their own future. The more courageously we learn from the mistakes of our own past, the stronger we become, the more successful we are in achieving a future for others too. But we encounter the past not only in the individual memories of our own lifetime. Temporarily, the past encroaches beyond that into the stories we are told early on in our families, by our grandparents in our hometowns, by friends' stories of events and things we have not experienced ourselves. We identify with these stories and thus become part of a collective identity, although this by no means implies a uniform identity, because we trust the people who tell us these stories. The Germans, the French have always been superficial. The Polish will never be able to build a state. The Ukrainians are not really on the height of our civilization. All these stories which have been told in our German families, prejudices which have constantly been told in our German families. We identify with these stories and thus become part of the collective identity, although, I said that. They often weave themselves like myths and shape our experience of the world at an early stage and in a long-term way. The more unconscious they are, the longer they are likely to endure. This can work out well, especially when the stories convey future-oriented behavior that is open to new things and shows a willingness to learn, one that lays the foundation for a long time learning. If my memories of my family convey to me that it is worth it to reach out to others, that strangers are not necessarily enemies, and that I can achieve self-imposed goals together with others, then it opens up that future of a successful life and freedom we all strive for is possible. However, when I am told that the world is bad, that I will always lose, that it's not worth it to learn, that hatred and honor belong together, or that elbows are the only instruments needed to get ahead, then I will be conditioned towards resignation and for a lifetime of struggle which precludes the idea of a future in freedom, justice, and solidarity. Not to mention the even more complicated strain of the past that is the daily bread of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I worked for 9 years in Frankfurt-Oder, coming from Berlin, and I'm back to Berlin. It was for me very, very interesting how that town, since the 19th century, had lived through one after the other social and political deceptions, deceiving. They have been important until the beginning of the 19th century. They were a university town, etc. Then the university left. They became state functionary people. After the First World War, they became very National Socialist. After 45, they became very communist. And after 89, they had lost everything, materially, morally, everything. I generalize, of course. But this is a very difficult precondition to develop civil courage, etc. They did, nevertheless, they did a lot. But when I arrived there and I had a lot of conversations, there was a lot of distrust between the people in Frankfurt-Oder. I learned much more about everybody than they would have learned amongst these others. And all that reached through decennia. And it was important as a culture. Any taxi driver would have told you that. In any case, what becomes clear is that our personal memories are often mixed with the memories of loved ones and provide us with a socially mediated image of the past that shapes our present and either opens up or closes paths towards the future and towards reconciliation. This influences our attitude towards the world, to other people, and to ourselves. We can achieve a future in freedom only when we examine these images of the past, when we examine our identification with the community in which we grew up, which was communicated to us, and to which we instinctively belong. When we consciously assume, change, or discard these worldviews. I do not say that you have all the time to be distant to it, but you take it over consciously, not just as an unconscious precondition of your life view. Otherwise, I am bound to repeat the mistakes of my ancestors. Learning from the past to achieve a future means being aware of the unconscious ties and strains we carry as individuals acting in our own name, and make use of what we deal with, design, and participate in a collective identity. If we don't confront the past, we remain tied to it and run the risk of losing our future in freedom. This is important not only for Germany, whose citizens are increasingly of different origins. Now, for instance, in Stuttgart, one of the big towns in Germany, or Hamburg, more than 50% of young kids who go into the kindergarten are from non-German origins. This is a different society from 40, 50 years ago. So this is important not only for Germany, but everywhere else as well. Not yet here, but that will come. And yet, does confronting the past automatically mean learning from it? There are entire libraries about what it means to learn. Learning occurs when there's something I know and I can do now that I couldn't do before. Learning is tied to take it up, to be open to innovation, to take something consciously and to mean and to develop my own judgment. Learning means the ability to renew, to innovate, and not just to repeat what a teacher has told me. This is the old learning theory, which is still very practiced in many places, of course, but which is not real learning. If you cannot really build up your own judgment in confrontation of what has been presented to you, you will never really learn. It is a prerequisite for being able to meet unforeseen challenges, real learning, the prerequisite for a future in freedom. This also applies to learning from the past. We encounter the past, however, not only as a personal, socially mediated memory, but also as a memory that is presented publicly. One could even say staged. This is where historiography comes into play. Personal recollection, public memory, and historiography do not occur neatly separated from one another. They relate to one another, influence one another, and challenge one another. Catastrophes tend to encourage reflections on the past. The ancient historian Thucydides began the famous treatise of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ with the so-called archaeology of war, and attempted to distinguish between events and the deeper sources of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. This work served as a model for historical research into the causes of conflicts over the course of centuries. In such studies, assumptions are made about the people, about the motives of their actions, their preferences, their weaknesses and strengths. General assumptions that the authors usually do not thematize, which nevertheless have a decisive influence on the result of their musings. If we assume, as Thucydides did, that people are most interested in increasing their own power, therefore we have this whole tradition from Thucydides about Hobbes, etc., and the international relations theory of the so-called realism. So if you assume that people, everybody from the beginning is interested in increasing their own power so as to be able to turn all potential enemies into subjects, if necessary, then we are likely to conclude that the sources of past events and the conclusions we can draw for the future are, in essence, inevitable power conflicts. I remember that also Richard Löwenthal, one of my really beloved teacher in political science, he always said, politics is power, politics is power, politics is power. It's not treaties, it's not a mutual understanding, politics is power. We would, however, come to a different conclusion if we saw war, which costs many lives and brings great sufferings, as having been caused by a lack of understanding and unnecessary prejudices and misunderstandings, not just inevitable play of power. In other words, in scientific whatsoever, much depends on what we are looking for and which causal relationships we consider to be important at the start of the investigation. This does not mean that the past can be easily bent into shape by the writing of history. However, we must nevertheless examine very closely which history book was written under which patterns and interpretation. One example of this can be found in the work of Leopold von Ranke, a very infamous historian of the 19th century in Germany. The discipline of history he saw itself as a pronouncedly national historiography that sought to unite and strengthen the German nation by writing its history. And this is very often considered by historians, that it's their duty to the nation to give a base to their self-esteem, to their self-understanding, and thus unite the nation. This was, by the way, also the lieu de mémoire. As society and state became more pluralized, and in particular after the tremors of 2 world wars, different and often conflicting interpretations appeared on the scene. After the catastrophes of National Socialism and World War II, that is, of totalitarianism and dictatorship, we saw in the post-dictatorial democratic societies major conflicts over the interpretations of history and its meaning for the here and now. At the latest in the 80s, the supremacy of the nation-state approach had come to an end in West Germany, historiography. From an historical perspective, the permanent existence of 2 German states appeared increasingly plausible. At the same time, West German historiography was increasingly focusing on groups and structures that had previously gone unrecognized. Lutz Niethammer's oral history, which gave ordinary people a chance to express themselves in long interviews, and the large-scale concept of social history promoted by Hans-Ulrich Wehler as a paradigm of this new approach. Admittedly, this did not occur without resistance. The interpretation of history became increasingly the site of competitive interpretation of the present. Were Germans a nation or willing executioners, were Germans a nation of willingly executioners, as Daniel Goldhagen argued 15 years ago, or were they the first of Hitler's victims under his National Socialist dictatorship? These battles of interpretation were unavoidable and good for Germany's democracy. At the beginning of the 80s, public broadcasters in Germany gave the instruction that the 8th of May 1945 should not be referred to as the Day of Liberation, which resulted in fierce historical political discussions. It was the GDR interpretation that the 8th of May was the Day of Liberation. Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker summed up the quintessence of a decades-long debate in a speech on the 8th May 1984, in which he brought together the controversial interpretations of the day as a collapse, Zusammenbruch, on the one hand, and as a liberation on the other, and both. The fact that the subjective memory of that day as a collapse was compatible with its political interpretation as a liberation from the dictatorial system was possible to the controversial discussion in the German public sphere, but also to the distance of the 40 years and was due to it, of the 40 years that had passed and suffused the wounds, and last but not least, to the fact that the president had been an officer in the German Wehrmacht. He knew equally of the suffering of German soldiers and civilians in World War II and the murder of European Jews and the crimes committed in the East. All that in the controversy of collapse and liberation. The double designation of the 8th of May 1945 as a collapse and a liberation points to something deeper. That is, that the meaning of the past for the present had not been definitively determined. Historian Thomas Nipperdey constantly warned us to be careful when seeking to draw lessons from history. For example, he argued against one-dimensional prehistories of National Socialism, in which everything moved towards one goal, as if there had existed no other alternatives, coincidences, ambiguities, and even unfortunate consolations without which German history might have taken a different turn. Thus, it becomes clear that the past and the present contain more potential than reality, and that for this reason, in order to achieve a future successful life, a successful life, both in the personal and political spheres, it is decisive to locate these potentials in terms of a desired future in freedom, justice, and solidarity. It would be fundamentally incorrect to take them simply as a given. If we can imagine this, then we can also avoid the unproductive alternative of interpreting National Socialism, whose epochal meaning, ongoing moral burden, and still noticeable devastating consequences are beyond any doubt, as either a necessary consequence of German history or as a mere operational accident. It is simply not an option to close the file of the Third Reich. On the contrary, we need to understand that history is never a completed narrative. In fact, the past is also constantly being rewritten and updated. This applies to National Socialism as well. Indeed, the view of the National Socialist regime also changes as a result of the question as to what we have learned from it. when we ascribe our contemporary individual and collective national sense of self-worth, which is shaped today by freedom and solidarity, to the rubble, wastelands of 1945, and the new beginning, it inaugurated what appears in the place of highly emotional interpretations derived from assumptions and cognitive interests in National Socialism, as was the focus of the famous Historikerstreit, is a view of the years from 1933 to 1945 characterized by a common will to learn from the past to serve the future. For example, with regard to how we treat minorities in society. The Nazi era, this view argued, would remain formative. However, in addition to that, we would hear, for example, the courageous never again, uttered by Kurt Schumacher as a moral imperative shortly after the catastrophe. In other words, instead of continuing to be silent about the past, which often occurs to this days, at least in the case of individual guilt, out of shame, we can apply historical responsibility in a productive manner to the present and future and allow ourselves to be judged based on what we have learned from our guilt by taking on responsibility for the future. The fate of the Weimar Republic, the first democracy on German soil, shows how important this responsibility is. Weimar began under difficult conditions, and yet the Republic did not fail due to the heavy burden of reparations and the Great Depression. Instead, it failed due to a lack of inner consensus as to how the new state should be seen in comparison to the monarchy that preceded it. The unresolved view of what had come before destroyed from the very outset the opportunities for freedom that the Weimar Republic Constitution had established. To conclude, I would like to mention the 9th of November. I would like to mention the 9th of November, a date of multiple commemorations in Germany, 1823, 38, 89. I would like to commemorate that not only of the Nazi regime, but also the political, cultural deficit of looking away and following the crowd in the German people. We know from research that Germans in 1938 were in no way a group of fanatical anti-Semites. Many were mortified by the hate speeches given by the Franconian Gauleiter Julius Streicher. Many Germans reacted to the staged so-called Kristallnacht with horror. They considered what happened to the businesses and synagogues and their neighbors to be inhuman and feared negative reactions from abroad. And yet, hardly anyone spoke out publicly against the plundering, destruction, and murder. About 1,300 people killed. The Berlin station chief, Wilhelm Kreutzfeld, who saved the synagogue on Oranienburger Straße from burning to the ground that might be going against orders, that night, by going against orders from above and calling firefighters to the scene, is the courageous exception to the rule. And such exceptions, they count. I have the impression that we now have a civil society in Germany that is capable and withstanding despotic activities when push comes to shove. The 9th of November in '89 shows how important this is. When it became clear to the citizens of the GDR that their individual dissatisfaction and the protest they were voicing in small circles had swelled into a movement that had gripped the entire country, the power of the Politburo was broken. East Germans freed themselves in November '89 and won the opportunity for Germany to live in peace. And yet, even as late as the spring of 1989, many of the East and West would still have said that the GDR was unshakable. The past and the present often contain unnoticed potential. It was not only their economic weaknesses, not only the international constellation, not only the power of television, but first and foremost the determination of the people who brought down the Berlin Wall. So Learning from the perspectivity of the past is important. Was this the beginning of a successful future for Germany? Not yet. As always with major upheavals, there were and still are unfulfilled expectations, resigned nostalgia, and bitterness among those who feel misunderstood, and a lack of understanding among those who find it hard to put themselves in other people's shoes. Even with Germany, we can learn patience from comparable upheavals in the past. We can also come to understand the opportunities that lie in listening. This applies to Germans from both sides on East and West, and it also applies to our society, which is becoming even more diverse. This is a society that comprises not only 40 years of two distinct German states with highly different experiences, but also increasingly that of the countries of origin and the personal collective memories of 8 million non-Germans and a similar number of Germans with so-called migration background. That means 16 million Germans. Their identity is also boosted by their perspective, pasts, and memories that are different from those of the, and I use this word in quotation marks, mainstream society. Like other countries in Europe, Germany is becoming more diverse. We welcome this as a potential enrichment, but at the same time, we recognize the challenges it brings. If we can no longer speak of one past, but instead are obliged to take into account a multitude of pasts, then we can no longer speak of one self-evident present. Our goal should be to continually re-establish commonality. The universally binding basis for this in Germany are the values and norms contained in our basic law, in our constitution, the Grundgesetz. And yet, in our highly modern society, the common ground prescribed in the law is under constant threat of failure, and we must take advantage of the power of debate to continually re-establish it so that it can remain vibrant. And the same, I think, is true for what we call reconciliation. This is never done. This needs a long preparation time in order to really grasp what has happened, what are the individual and social responsibilities, what were the conditions under which crimes, etc., happened. And only when we, in this way, dehomogenize the collective entities, we can really come to a true reconciliation. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Schwan, for your keynote lecture. I think this was a very fundamental, very principal lecture with a lot of important insights, which will be very helpful for our conference. I just recall a few points you have made. I would say reconciliation as a process, not as a given, and you made that point at the end. Again, then you have questions, categories we use, or we so often use as collective identity, for instance, just one of the categories. In principle, I would say, I think you have had a very positive, optimistic note in your lecture, just telling us that reconciliation is a task, but it's also some kind of an anthropological necessity for making or for having a meaningful, good life, present life, future life. And then you, of course, you have dealt then in more detail with the concept of freedom and with the concept of past, and telling us that there are probably a multitude of past, that it is important to deal responsible with the past, that pasts are retold, that pasts are rewritten, and that this is always a challenge to us. And you have spoken less about states than about people and as citizens, and it's a task for everybody, for citizens as well as for states. So you spoke against a rigid dividing line between the personal and the public also. So these are just a few of the fundamental thoughts you have given us. And of course, we could move on, because at the end, you finished your talk with going back to 1989. That means to Germany. We could move on from 1989 now to the present, and to open the discussion from Germany to Europe, or to the European Union. And of course, I would be very interested to hear a few words from you, that at least from an Ukrainian perspective in the past 2 years, we heard that that Europe has forgotten Ukraine, for instance, that that Ukraine and the revolution of Maidan, or the struggle for freedom, for a meaningful life and dignity, was forgotten, was not taken up in Europe as it should have been. So what does this tell us about Europe? So if I can open the question from Germany, but you can include, of course, Germany too. What does this tell us about Germany and its relations to the East, or its relations to Ukraine? Or what does it tell us for Europe and the current stage of art of reconciliation in Europe? Could you add, or could you tell us a few words just in following up your talk?
I mean, of course, I'm extremely interested in the perspective of the auditorium about what are the prerequisites of reconciliation, also what you consider as being the main challenges for dealing with the past, for reconciliation in Ukraine or in Central Eastern Europe, etc., because I clearly limited myself to the German example. But what you suggested is certainly true. The fact that to live under oppression, the fact that at least superficially the Western European publics presently do not seem to be very interested in Ukraine, which maybe is not really true, because we always live under the condition that there are medial hypes. There was the hype of Greece for about 5-6 months. Now Greece is nearly never mentioned in the newspapers. Then before it was Ukraine, now it are the refugees. So this is also a created impression of what people think of, which is maybe not really what they are thinking of. But in fact, one could get the impression that one of the reasons for the crisis in the European Union is that people in the European Union do not really have any more inner ties to what they call the values, namely a life in freedom, solidarity, and justice. Now, I tend to say this must not be true. I really see a very negative mechanism of the fact that the European Union, during the last nearly 10 years, has been more and more dealt with by the European Council. That means the head of states. That it has become more and more in the public perception of an association of national states. And the heads of the national states are extremely interested in bringing about the news which is important to be re-elected within their national communities. This has brought about other reasons too. A very disruptive European Union. And I'm not so sure if the societies are the same. I very much believe in the initiatives of civil society. I still believe in representative democracy, that's true. But let me say, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I would not have all the time told something about civil society organization. I wouldn't have. Would have thought, okay, there are the general elections, and they have elected the parliament, and the parties are doing their job, etc., and then the governments will integrate the various interests, etc., and make policies. I think this doesn't work anymore for many reasons, for globalization, for many reasons, for much more diverse societies, etc. So I think without separate and independent activities of civil society, we will not overcome our problems, neither in the East nor in the West. And if we take into account what civil society organizations do, transnational, without always thinking about the framework of national re-elections, which are necessary. I don't see any democratic state without national re-elections, of course. But you need a counter power, so to say, against that. And then, if you take into consideration the European Union not just as the assembly of heads of states, but as a context of societies that might be different. Take the Greek case where I was very much committed because I suffered from how Germany dealt with Greece. I found that really abominable, I have to say, because Germany is powerful and has really kind of repressed Greece into a policy which cannot really work in Greece. And my own party too, the Social Democrats, that made me even more suffer. So, and I would say there are many, many Germans who think like me. But where is their voice received? Where is it reported? I'm traveling around in Germany and having talks to my party just before coming here. I was in Goslar, the hometown of my party leader, Sigmar Gabriel. Well, a church full with 600 people. They gave me the title, "But that cannot work in Greece." This was the title they invited me to have a talk to. And I said, no, in fact, it cannot work. And what Sigmar Gabriel, who is living in that town, is doing is not good. So it's much more controversial. And this is only if you really recognize that all these collective identities, parties, associations, etc., are much more complex, and that people are having more their own judgment, and that you can appeal to it, you might keep a little bit to my optimism. I know that people always say you are too optimistic. This is a kind of personal characteristic. I do not want to be sad, so I want to be active and to do something more. But I have good reasons. If you talk to people, I have not met one party group during the last time which would have been fine with what our party did. No, not one. But these problems, being in a coalition, a grand coalition, having a chancellor who is so popular, at least if you see the surveys, etc. This brings them into a position, and I would like to show that Europe is much more. And also that they are dealing with Ukraine, and there are many people who are interested in what is happening, of course, who are interested. Putin, this is one thing, and probably, that is what Schulz-Wessel said to me yesterday, without Putin interfering in the Crimea, the conflict between East Ukraine and Western Ukraine could have been managed. I can't say, but there is a conflict between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. That is at least what I learned for a number of years. This is also important to overcome if you want to stay a national state. And in that case, you have to try to overcome close collective identities. Otherwise, you will not obtain a reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you, and there will be time to discuss this in more detail. I think when you spoke about reconciliation, you told us that both sides, or the sides who want to reconcile, have to be prepared for this. And because you were so active for many years in promoting German-Polish relations, I would like to get some further information from your sides. How did this work, or did this work, and when did this work in German-Polish relations after 1945? Could you say us a few words more about this? And of course, we should distinguish between our between Europe, European Union, and of course it is clear that, well, if I say that Europe has neglected Europe, then we have a difference between Germany and Poland and other countries. That is, of course, important.
Yeah, I mean, when I started the German-Polish business, so to say, I do not even know when I started it, because my mother came from Upper Silesia, as you said. And so, and both parents were active in the resistance. So I was told from the beginning, very good news about Poland, very bad news about Germans, growing up in a German family. And the whole thing was a little bit seen in the national historical tradition, right? The Poles in general. And I had a kind of positive prejudice for Poland. And then I experienced Poland in the 60s. First trip was in 65. And I saw that there was a variety. I remember a first discussion with the Polish communist youth in 65. A very rough discussion, because they condemned any pluralism. Now, I was a convinced activist for reconciliation, but I did not want to combat pluralism. So my first little experience with Poland. And next one, when I prepared my dissertation on Leszek Kołakowski, there was somebody, a younger guy, whom I met in Warsaw, where I was for the language course. Then I met him suddenly in Krakow, where my language course went on. Then I met him suddenly again in Warsaw. Of course, I realized that it was not suddenly. And he finally contacted me and said that he came from the cultural ministry. Okay. So I was not that naive. I was 23 years old, but I was not that naive. And he always wanted to go dancing. And I always said, well, I am fiancé, I don't want, etc. But he wanted absolutely. I don't know if he thought that there would be a vodka effect or whatsoever. Anyhow, so finally we went into a bar and we went dancing. And then he told me all bad stuff about Jews. He turned out to be a strong anti-Semite, and this was Moczar. It was the time of anti-Zionism in Poland, where they always wrote in Tribuna Ludu, when they spoke about Adam Michnik, Porodzenia Żydowskiego, so that everybody would know this is a Jew. So I thought, well, where do I find myself? I'm dancing with this guy, I am working for reconciliation with Poland, and he turns out to be an anti-Semite. But my parents had hidden a Jew. Now, it's a complex situation, but I understood, of course, that not each Pole is like the other, and one has. If I want to go on working for reconciliation, I have to find out what are the differences in this country. And I have to say, when I lived there, I was mostly with strong anti-communists, but from the left. You know, reversed communists, reversed of socialists whatsoever. I was not in close contact with those from Prawo I Sprawiedliwość. That means I was not in close contact with reactionary national Poles. The only thing which I discovered was my first time when I was in Krakow in the Marienkirche, and I went to the Holy Mass. I discovered that they all went on knees to the Holy Communion, about 20 meters on knees. I was quite astonished. And I suddenly understood why Kołakowski did not like, humility. Because it was very close to humiliation. Humility is Demut, right? And I liked humility, of course, to be modest, etc. But this was not to be there as a self-determined free person. Another aspect I learned when I was in Poland, and I learned, of course, I'm a practicing Catholic, but I learned that there is a variety of Catholicisms. So more and more, when I wanted to argue and when I wanted to keep to my moral commitment of reconciliation, I found out that I have first to analyze what is happening. I cannot just say, oh, I want to reconcile. No. Why should they with me? I mean, I was not really as a person interesting for them. So I am clearly convinced that if you want to come to terms about the past and to cooperate for the future, to be kind of sober, you have to know what you have done yourself, you have to know what the others have done, they have to try to find out. And you find that situation in your personal communication and also in social communications. If you meet somebody whom you find ready to be self-critical, of course, reconciliation is much easier. But if you find somebody who would always be right, in the long run, it's not really interesting, right? So to be self-critical, to see what are the weaknesses of one's own position is a clear precondition for reconciliation and the diversity. And as I said with Adam Michnik and Bismarck and these 6 volumes of German-Polish memories, they totally socially disintegrate the national memories. The official national memories, of course, seem to be homogeneous, but they change every 20 years. It depends on the regime, right? Or every 30 years. The official memory of Polska Ludowa is different from the present official memory, right? So if you want to stay an independently thinking person, and I am a German Kantian, that is true, I want to have my independent judgment, then you have really to find out what are the various historical interrelations, preconditions, etc. It is also a question of justice, because otherwise, if you take these collective identities without checking what has happened, you can be extremely unjust in a positive or a negative way. You can overlook what people who seem to be heroes have done, and you can overlook what people who seem to be morally doubtful have done nevertheless. And there I am convinced totally of the whole theory of conscience. This is a difficult thing, because sometimes it takes people 10 years to understand what they did wrong. It's not just from one minute to the other, because it's only when you revise yourself in a whole context with revising all your moral criteria, etc., that you step by step can come to a judgment what you could have done differently in the context. And sometimes you cannot even state, because you were educated in a certain context. I was completely educated in a, so to say, undangerous conflict. I was in a resistant family. Everything was fine. I was not really in danger to be a National Socialist. Never. But people who have been brought up in such a milieu, and I have confronted such people with the German student movement, who very often were rebellious because they grew up in a National Socialist or a strong right-wing hierarchical Catholic context. Well, they were brought up much less with individual judgment, etc. They were brought up in collective identities, and I'm very, very doubtful with collective identities.
Thank you. So I would like to open the discussion to everybody. So if you would like to comment or to come up with questions to Professor Schwan, please. So there's some time left. I think we have about 30 minutes left at the Holy Case, and then Frank Gesine.
Thank you so much. I found this very interesting. At the very end, just now, that you said that you were a Kantian, but it seems as though what was missing from the talk that you gave is a sense of universalism that's part of Kant. And I would love to hear you clarify how a democratic society that seeks reconciliation and that has an open debate. I mean, the only moment in your talk when you mention universalism is with Constitution and the law. And I thought that was an apt reference, because it's precisely constitutions and the law that have proven to be the first frontier of the erosion of liberal democracy. Particularly, I'm thinking of Hungary and Poland most recently. And that they appear to be quite fragile, as a matter of fact, in our time. And so if that's the only place where the universalisms are housed, and if they're very vulnerable, and if in the spirit of public debate there are multiple perspectives that are, necessarily come into play, where is the universalism that will defend the kind of future that you optimistically and hopefully rightfully presage? I'm wondering if that can be done without universalism, or if you see universalism in places other than the law and constitutions, or if there's a place in civil society for universalisms, and what those universalisms might be in our time when the universalisms of idealism of the 20th century have been largely devaluated or delegitimated by dint of the fact that many of them proved to be falsely utopian. For example, fascism, socialism, state socialism, etc. And so, can there be a new universalism that is democratic, or has democracy definitively let go of universalism?
Should we collect 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, please.
Okay, then Francis, please, and then Martin.
It'll be hard to go in a different direction. Listening to you, one thing that's struck me in a way is that the European project, in a certain way, became a convenient or a useful shell for the German reconciliation, reforming of German identity, reconstituting Germany in the modern world. What do I think of the German nationality problem, the working out of the 2 German states? What would German identity, what would German nation be? Or even the issue today of the Germany of today could not exist, but we have to think of to what degree were the Turks integrated in for so long a period of time. And in a way, these issues could be avoided by Germany because of the European project. I'm not saying this in any sinister or conspiratorial way, but it seems to have so worked out that this gave Germany the time to have internal German reconciliation, create a new German identity, and develop a new type of pluralistic approach in German society. And does that in a certain way undermine the European project? That is, that much of the rest of Europe did not need these necessarily, nor did they take part in those processes in the same way. And does that in a certain way weaken Europe?
And I take the third question. Question by Martin.
Well, I refer to your discussion with Guido Hausmann about optimism, and I share your optimistic approach, and I think that confidence into the society is necessary for politics. But I wanted to ask in a philosophical sense, what is your view on this religious concept of Erbsünde, of heritage sin? And is there something inevitable, maybe not in the sense of Thucydides and Richard Löwenthal, but in a broad sense?
So thank you. We will have a second round. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I would like to look to the faces, and therefore I have to send. Otherwise, I can't see you. So theoretically, of course, I start from universalism. This is clear. Kantian would start from universalism. This is the general imperative, and that is a universal one, right? But of course, if I take culturalism as a counterpart to universalism, there is this idea. There was a reproach always that Europe is a kind of European cultural colonialism, etc. I do not share that. I think theoretically still that the Declaration of Human Rights is a universal one, that the United Nations start as universal. This is even empirically, institutionally fixed. So I do not very much commit myself into these discussions. Of course, all these values, all these moral imperatives, all these justice imperatives, etc., are always inserted in cultural surroundings, and this becomes a clear question of hermeneutics. It is difficult to understand what somebody would say with a German, with a Ukrainian, with an American, with a Latin American, etc. past, what they would say. Take anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism in the German context could be anti-liberalism, could be racism, could be whatsoever. And if you get into Latin America, well, you find rarely somebody would not be anti-American, right? So this is a whole context you have to, and then you have patiently to find out what is behind the hermeneutics, right? Now you said that what could be a new democratic universalism? Still, in a theoretical sense, I'm not so doubtful. I'm quite sure that there's nobody who would say, yes, I think suppress freedom is a good thing. They would say something else. They would say, well, this is not freedom whatsoever. But the values, I would say, are recognized. Now, that they are vulnerable, this is of course true. And for me, in my head, this means that a constitution, a written down constitution, is one thing, and you can change a constitution rather quickly, but the corresponding culture is a very difficult thing. The mentalities, they change very, very slowly for the reasons I have presented. So the regime changed, even if it is from inside, is a long process. It does not come from one point to the other. And I'm not so sure that democracy, if it is taken as a frame of liberty, if it is practiced in a social sense, that means not just formal liberal, but that you would have also from your material and social position the right to exercise your liberty, etc. If it is practiced with solidarity, that it would be a concept which people would not agree to. I think they do. But it appears in public in such a power technique game that it is not attractive anymore for many people. I confess that from my generation, I'm extremely existentially tied to democracy. And I try to fight for it, but of course only in learning that the present, even in the West, the present forms of democracy are not sufficient. That you have to add up with civil society and etc. with all that. But so universalism theoretically, in my view, is not done. And if you take all the civil society organization in Africa or in Latin America, I think Peter Eigen is there with his corruption stuff. I mean, he has his anti-corruption fighters in Africa and Latin America and Asia. They all fight corruption. It's not that for them culturally corruption is fine. It's not true. That is what was very often argued in Germany. So I believe in universalism, but one has to practice this universalist democracy in the sense that they are not just written on paper, but that people who are born in Germany would not from the beginning, about 20%, have no chance of education. That is what is happening presently in Germany. 20% of people who are not anymore integrated. 20% in a rich country like Germany. And people do not feel embarrassed. The social democracy says that is not good, and the dependency of social origin is not good in our education system. And what follows out of that? Of course, many activities, that's true. It's not so that things do not change, but very slowly, and I think it's a shame, for instance, for Germany, that in fact, a large proportion of young kids have not equal opportunity, simply not equal opportunity. And they have to fight. But I never consider democracy, universal democracy, as something which is given. It's always to be fought for. This is, so to say, my primordial confession. Falsely utopian, yes. Well, for one time, this is an advantage of social democrats. I have never considered social democracy as utopian. I have to say that. I will come back to the Erbsünde. But being a non-very orthodox Christian, I have never thought that we can have the heaven on earth. I've never believed in the heaven of earth. So no utopian stuff, but of course, the remaining idea, first of all, of progress, of humanitarian progress, and this I want to stick to. If I would think we are in a kind of digression, it would be difficult. There I am also Kantian. Ideen zu einer heißt das nochmal, Geschichte in weltbürgerlicher Absicht. Yeah, one of his pieces is the ideas of a universal history. In German it is in weltbürgerlicher Absicht. That means with the purpose of the aim or the perspective of universal citizen.
Yeah, citizen in the world.
Citizen in the world. And the point is that he knew, of course, Kant, that there is no logic in history, that this is just interpretation. History as such has no logic. But he wants that history leads to a better world, to say it very naively. And therefore, he tries to discover in history the empirical points which would help his belief, so that you would not fight for nothing, but that you would find some empirical support for what you are fighting for. But what you are fighting for is your belief and your energy and your strength. Yeah, of course. The European Union was, in many contexts, it was made so also to bind Germany, of course, like NATO. But it helped many Germans not to really go through the whole intellectual debate of their national identity. That is true. They could fly, so to say, we are European. They could evade the national heritage, the negative heritage. That is true, yes. On the other hand, there were also a lot of people in Germany through the generations who did not only fly, but who tried to make both of them, to see what has happened in their past and to see what could be the future in Europe. Now, the last, I hope I do grasp what you asked me, is the last about 10 years. I think that the role of the German government in European policies was very bad, because they reintroduced strongly, and this is Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, she introduced strongly a national state point of view. She always acted from a national point of view, and the national short-sighted interest. What is good for Germany? A key word for that is no bailout. She gave her judicial reasons for that. That's true. You could, the Maastricht criterion and all that, they never obliged any national state to help others. That is true. Any national state could help voluntarily. They could. The judicial point is not really valid in that. So, as soon as to start as a strong and the strongest state in Europe, and Germany was always the strongest state in Europe, independently from the present economic situation, which is a strong one, but even independently in history, and that is a whole problem for Germany also, they were strong. So if this strong state starts by saying Europe is gotten in a crisis and we do not bail out states, this is the start of desolidarization, in my view. This is a negative start. And on the other hand, complementary, they more and more determined the European politics. What Kohl and others always wanted to avoid, namely, that the German government would redominate Europe, she started more and more. And not very, well, many people did not see it because she seems so nice and so not, modest, and she doesn't have big villas, and she doesn't have any corruption and all that stuff. She doesn't have any affair. She is so good, solid, nice. And she's extremely calculating with power, and she knows her business. How to calculate power in personal politics, this is an important field of power, by informal pressures, etc. And I think that in addition to the story which has been told also by the German media about the reasons of the crisis, namely, it is not the German problem, it's the German of the southern states who are behaving irresponsibly, who are not strong, but we are strong because we were really strong with our reforms of Schröder, which were not really strong reforms. That's not true. The only thing, the unemployed, they were badly treated, and they are, until now, badly treated as soon as they are considered as being their fault that they have no job. This is the point in it, no other point. So the Germans more and more got to a position where they dominate Europe. And now, even if from inside you got very isolated, if from inside you said, you will have die Quittung, the receipt. I do not like how the Poles reacted to the refugees, because sometimes that was also in a religious limitedness. They don't want to take Muslims, etc. But the general tendency of the German government to decide in the nuclear energy, to decide with the refugees, just decide and then maybe ask somebody else, not before. Of course, created a general resentment. Why always the Germans decide? Why should we help if the Germans always decide? And the more as the policy was not the reflected one. It was a spontaneous decision. So that during the years, they were not always invited to take part, but they got used to be dominated. I'm very hard, I know, but I say that because I'm very tied to the European Union. And then suddenly, Germany gets into a mess because it's a rich country and everybody wants to get into that country. But now Germany needs the help of the others. Before, Germany never asked herself, well, do the Greeks need our help? Do the Spanish people need our help? That was not their question. They interpreted it in a completely moral way, the economic developments in a moral way, which is completely false, right? This is not an individual moral decision, which is the moral hazard all the time cited, was misleading. So now I would say the Germans will come to a real complicated situation, because I do not know personally how to find a way to build channels for the refugees. I do not believe that the refugees will be halted. I don't think so. They will come. And in Germany, those who are against Mrs. Merkel, from other point of views than I did it now, they want to close the borders. What does it mean? If the Germans close the borders, then the Austrians will close the borders, and then the whole route of the Balkans will be closed. What does it mean? What does it mean for Europe? What does it mean? It is not well reflected. It was not well reflected. And I have the impression that the lack of solidarity the German government has shown is now having its results, so to say. It is very bitter, but politics is always a situation that you have to start from a point which has arrived. You cannot just say, well, I would like to get back 3 years ago. No, we have to start now. And this is, in my view, one of the most difficult situations for Germany and for Europe. Not that I think that the 1 million refugees would destroy Germany. I don't think that at all. In the 50s, we had about 50 million inhabitants, and we had about 8 million people, Germans, right, but culturally quite different from the East, who were integrated under materially much more difficult situations in the 50s. Now we are 80 millions. It is 1.1% what we got. It is quite different from what we got in the 50s. So all these Obergrenze, we will have to have another storytelling about what has happened in Europe, and we will have to find a new text. I'm not so sure. I hope that I understood your question right, but the German identity, which is not a homogeneous identity. We have a lot of identities in Germany. And what I understand by identity is that we have constantly to build bridges of hermeneutics. How do the Muslims understand themselves? How do certain groups within the Muslims understand themselves? And nothing is more dangerous than to address somebody against her or his self-understanding. This is what makes people furious. It's not 100 or 200 euro less. If you misunderstand people, if you suggest that they are guilty and all that stuff, then you really create social distress. And that is what is happening, and we have to overcome that in Germany. I do not say that all the other countries are better off. France is in a miserable situation presently, in a miserable situation. And I am not so sure if the whole concept of état laïque is really viable. It is a certain form of universalism, but maybe a rigid one, which does not understand that the universal values can be realized in culturally different ways, in religiously different ways. And these are discussions which go together with globalization and which are not solved in Germany, but not solved in France. I think France is in a miserable cultural situation presently, and maybe others too. Yeah, die Erbsünde. We had a long discussion, my husband and me. He is a poor Protestant. I am a Catholic. So you see fundamental oppositions within our marriage. But the problem is, I grew up not baptized because my Protestant father, who had left the Protestant church during the First World War, when he, as a volunteer soldier, had seen, as he told me, that the churches blessed, he said, the arms. Of course, they didn't bless the arms, but they blessed the people. But he stationed near the border in the First World War, 17 years old, 18 years old, he heard the churches bless the various nations who then afterwards killed each other. So he left the Protestant church. And he obliged my Catholic mother that my brother and me would not get baptized. Not that he wanted us to be pagans, but he wanted that we decide ourselves. He was a Kantian too, so he was very important for me in that sense. And I got rather close to the Christian faith, but in the tradition of my father, I wanted to decide that very rationally if I would become a Protestant or Catholic. I studied theology, and of course, the Erbsünde was an important point, right? And St. Augustine, who has an awful theology, a great theologian, but an awful theology about people who are eternally condemned, you know, 22nd chapter of Civitas Dei, awful, left forever to, yeah. This is already something which I could not stand, and Leszek Kołakowski did not stand that neither, I remember that. But there is kind of tendency between the fundamental idea of Catholic theology and Protestant theology, considering the influence the original sin has on our lives. And I finally decided to become Catholic. The authority of the Pope was not so important because conscience is always superior. I take St. Thomas and I can live with St. Thomas. But the point is that Aristotle getting into the St. Thomas, etc., meant that human nature is not destroyed until the bottom. But it needs grace, it needs help, but you can also rely on your reason and on the instincts of your human nature. It is not destroyed from the beginning. And this is important for me. It's not a utopian idea. Pelagius, the adversary of St. Augustine, who did not want the original sin, he in a way tried to get away with the sin. I would not share that, but there's always this temptation, there's always a limitedness of people. We have always the difficulty, we have always to expect that reconciliation will not happen. But we have enough hope that it can happen. And within that space, we can act. If we are utopian and think, well, things will succeed, I don't think we can act. But if we could not hope on that universal base, also of reasoning, right? Because it's our common participation in reasoning with all the cultural differences, which can help us. And therefore, this was for me also an existential question. Therefore, I had to smile when you said that. You know, and we have some discussions sometimes in the evening when we have our last glass of red wine in the kitchen. Then sometimes we discuss original sin, but only very seldom.
Thank you, Gesine Schwan. I take a second round of questions. I think.
I would like to come back to the question of universal, but from the opposite end, very different end. Namely, you said that to dehumanize collective identities is a precondition for reconciliation. The homogenized, the pluralization of collective identity is a precondition, which I share. But the question arises, what are the reasonable limits of the plurality of collective identities? And I ask this question not just out of a tendency for contrarian thinking, because there are reasonable limits on anything, but also because the conditions of the contemporary technologies, of mediating technologies and the market are conducive for the multiplication, the fragmentation of identities and communities in the smaller and smaller group and non-territorial groups. So what is for you the reasonable limit on this welcome process of dehomogenization of collective identities?
Thank you. There's a second question and a third question, then
thank you very much. I actually also have a question similar to the one was just asked about this process of deconstruction of collective identities that you have advocated.
The
deconstruction of collective identities as a precondition for reconciliation. My question is this. I don't know if you would agree with my interpretation of what you said, but it seems to me in advocating this deconstruction of collective identities, you sort of stop implicitly short of deconstructing the national collectivity, right? You're still talking about German reconciliation, right, or within Germany, what happens in France, what happens in Poland, what happens in Ukraine. So in that, to me, the implicit assumption is that, yes, like in German society, there are these different groups that have complex identities, but there is this such thing as German society, and there is such thing as French society, and Ukrainian, and so forth. So my question is, in your understanding, what is the uniting base of these, like, first of all, if that's indeed the correct interpretation on my part, that you are still treating these larger national societies as, in some sense, objectively existing collectivities, and if you do, what is it that unites them as a collectivity, right? I can imagine from a universalist perspective, one answer would be that it is the commitment to democratic values and this process that you talked about of sort of questioning yourself, right? But then my question would be, how is one democratic society different from another democratic society? What is the point of having like a separate German society if really what holds it together is not that much different than what holds a Swedish society together, or, you know, French society for that matter, right? And I understand that this is an important debate among, you know, people, for example, who study immigrant integration, right? If we are going to teach immigrants like some values of our society, right? And if all we teach them is about commitment to democracy, then again, like, how is France different from Sweden, and, you know, and so forth, right? So I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on that.
The question
Thanks.
is clear. Thank you. And there's a last question over there.
Hello. I have a question also to the point of identity. And as we see in Germany, West and East, there are some differences with the refugees, how they are reacting on the crisis. What do you think, what we missed in Germany, that both parts are still, after 25 years, not together, not feeling like one nations, because as I understand the conflict, it's more than just they're coming now refugees and we're afraid it's more against this kind of democracy, like the famous word Lügenpresse. And this problem, what we have in Germany, I see some kind of similarity with Ukraine, with western and eastern parts. There are also different identities With eastern part in Ukraine, they are more pro-Soviet, and the western part, they're more Western, of course, for his historic reasons. What are your thoughts about this?
Okay, thank you very much. So there's
3 to 5 minutes left. Limits of pluralism. A very essential question, sure, normatively. What is basic in tolerance is that you are not tolerant if you just let go people. But if you protect people even if they do say something which you do not share, because you stick to their individual personal judgment. It is an active attitude, it's not just a let go. The theoretical limits to pluralism would be, for me, where people do not accept the definition of dignity of the individual in self-determination. This would be the main point. And in order to do that practically, you need justice and solidarity. So the acceptance, the active acceptance of all the others having the same right to self-determination is, for me, the theoretical point. Or take Montesquieu, l'amour de l'égalité in l'esprit des lois. L'amour de l'égalité. L'amour, c'est quelque chose de très fort. If you love something, it's not just that you accept it. And l'amour de l'égalité, for Montesquieu, is the condition for republicanism. That means that you want others to be equal in their right of self-determination. This is theoretical, so to say, the base. Now, practically, it is on the one hand written down in the Constitution and in laws. And as soon as an ideology or a practical action tends to instrumentalize another person, you cannot accept that anymore. Which does not mean that for instance, in pluralism you should not have prisons. Sure, prisons are necessary if people act against laws, etc. So this is, I think, what is necessary. Maybe a short notice on civil courage, civil disobedience is interesting. The discussion between Habermas and Rawls says that civil disobedience is okay, but you have to accept the legal consequences. If you decide to act against laws in order to protect the value system of democracy, you have theoretically to go into prison. Because otherwise you destroy the fundamental system of law. I had a very interesting discussion with Chinese people of the party school of Chinese about that. They were very interested about the foundation of civil disobedience because they know that their Chinese society is completely atomized, completely. There's no socialism in that. And they are interested in that. What's the point of having still a German or a French or a Ukrainian society? They will get all similar to each other if I just deconstruct collective identities until that point. For me, it was important to draw the picture of societies which would be able to live together. This is my point. I am not so worried about the difference between a Polish, Ukrainian, or German society. So if there are differences, that's okay. If there are less differences, for me it's also okay. I do not depend, as a German, of the idea that I am part of a German society which fundamentally is different from a French one. I've been brought up in a French school. This is a very important experience. I have learned Corneille, Racine, and La Fontaine, etc. And this is part of my identity. So I think that our societies, given this globalization, will change the more and more. And maybe in 50 years, the differences between French society and German society, and even Ukrainian society, will not be that important as it is now. But that doesn't frighten me. I don't think that some things get lost. This is a little bit behind you, that a certain amount of quality of national societies would get lost. And I don't think so. I had an interesting experience with young people for 5 years. On the 27th of January, this is our commemorial day of Auschwitz, I had to deal, we have a ceremony in our Bundestag, and I had to deal with people from France, Germany, and Poland, who had made a long excursion, 2 weeks through concentration camps, etc. And then I had to talk to them, and then afterwards they would have to talk to a speaker who was invited by the Bundestag, a former person who had been imprisoned in Auschwitz or wheresoever. It was very interesting to me to observe that. The first years, mostly the young Germans had German parents and German grandparents. And they were in that line of German society. But the more and more, there were young Turks in it, and young Poles in that, and other origins. So they didn't have SS grandparents, but they went to Treblinka, and they went to Auschwitz. What is their feeling? That was very interesting, because to be tied by generations and by family to your national society is a very strong tie. But they came from Turkey. Why should they be tied to the problem of German SS grandparents? They had other grandparents. And what they told me was that on the one hand, they were very much integrated in the present German society. And when they were visiting Auschwitz or Treblinka, they were motivated by human rights, by universal human rights. This was there, and they had immediately associations how human rights were humiliated in Turkey, or where they came from. So I think we have to be open in a sequential change of societies, because individual and collective identities are made by memories. They are not just objectively there. They are made by memories. And the memories change. There are different compositions. So from my knowledge from Poland, I understand that you would say, well, but that's not possible. Our Polish society cannot be deconstructed like that. They are still very much, on the one hand, connected, but Poland is split. You have youngsters in Poland who are not anymore that tied, who are cosmopolitan, who are extremely interested and successful in business, and their loyalties are not primarily Polish. So you have a complete disruption of social ties, and I think it is extremely necessary in that kind of modernization which we have with neoliberalism, and this is one of the points with the present Polish government. The whole society is very disrupted and very insecure, mentally very insecure, and therefore you have to build bridges, but not, I would not start from the point you have originally objectively findable Polish society. You have a constant changing Polish society. One nation in Germany. Well, political culture counts, of course. And I think it is extremely important to, like in other cases, to see how German and Polish and whatsoever individuals grew up. My 9 years in Eastern Germany, namely in Frankfurt, were very important for me. It was for me very interesting that many of my colleagues, when we had the New Year's reception, one New Year reception after the other. You had to attend and you had to have, etc. And after 3-4 years, many people asked me, are you a West German or an East German? They hadn't known me before I took over that position. In Western Germany, everybody would know that I'm a West German because I have published in newspapers, etc. But they didn't know it anymore. And then I asked them, well, what do you think? Am I a West German or an East German? And they said, well, I don't know. You are not the real West German, but you are not the real East German neither. And I think not to be a real in that sense is wonderful, right? Because what I wanted is, I have never hidden my origin, but what I wanted is that they do not perceive me as somebody who comes and tells them what is right and what is wrong. But first asks them. But I have told them. They would know from the beginning that my point is with democracy. And I was a so-called right-wing social democrat because I was anti-communist, and I am anti-communist for liberal left-wing reasons. Or for liberal reasons, left-wing we can let that aside. I'm not the right-wing racist anti-communist. There is such an anti-communism too. That's not my point. But that you would not be from the beginning attributed to a collectivity. This is important to communicate, to understand yourself. And it is not illoyal. I'm not illoyal to my values. I'm trying to tell them my values, but not to confront them with my values. And I think this sharing, this openness is absolutely necessary. By the way, it is not the whole East Germany. It is Saxonia, with also the history of Saxonia after '89. This is also already a history, right? So it's complex. And the believing in civil society, we have these people. In Frankfurt-Oder, we have had a lot of activities. And I value that much more than in Baden-Württemberg. Because in Baden-Württemberg, you have 2 centuries of civil society initiatives. In Frankfurt-Oder, you had only 30 years, right? So that grows up, and my main point with deconstruction is, I think you should always, I try always to see that I belong to collectivities, of course. And not only from outside, but also from loyalties, etc. But I try to never tie my self-esteem to any collectivity. This is the danger of chauvinism and nationalism. If I tie my self-esteem to a collectivity, if I depend on the moral quality of my collectivity in order to be a moral being, this is extremely dangerous, because you will always tend to defend the moral behavior of your collectivity, even if it is not grounded.
Thank you very much, Gesine Schwan. Very, very good last words in your last answer. I'm very grateful that you shared your views, your ideas with us, very fundamental principle ideas, and I think they are very helpful for our conference. I also take the praise of optimism you gave us, and we think we should take this into the next sessions too.